Salone Airfield, southern Italy. The radio hissed its last words from a lone P-47 somewhere over the Adriatic. Fuel zero, losing power. Then nothing, just static. On the ground, the tower crew quietly wrote the verdict into the logbook: aircraft lost. 20 minutes later, a spotter on the ridge shouted, "Contact! One bird coming in slow!" Heads snapped up. A silver P-47 floated in over the coastline like a ghost, too quiet, too steady, prop just windmilling in the breeze. It kissed the runway in total silence and rolled to a stop. When the crew popped the caps and checked the lines, every tank was bone dry. There is not enough fuel for taxis, let alone fly extra miles. The pilot, still shaking, just pointed at the propeller and muttered, "It wasn't me." The air wanted to hold us up. That's when everyone turned toward the lean figure at the edge of the crowd. Staff Sergeant Roy Bennett, the crazy blade doctor, standing there like a man who already knew exactly what physics had just been broken. Before that landing, every man in the Army Air Forces believed one simple gospel: fuel is flight, especially in a P-47. The jug was a heavy brute with a huge R2800 up front and a massive four-blade prop. At combat power, it drank fuel like there was no tomorrow. Pilots knew the numbers by heart. 2 hours, maybe 3, if you babied it. If the engine quit, that big prop would become a spinning wall of drag. Instructors hammered it into every briefing: lose the engine in a jug, you look for a field, not for home. A dead P-47 was supposed to drop like a safe. That's why the quiet little fact about Collier's landing hit harder than flak. The tanks weren't low, they were empty. On paper, what he had just done was not a flight. It was an accident that refused to happen. Roy Bennett didn't come from the laboratory. He came from a barn outside of Tulsa. His father fixed tractors, his mother towed one room of school, and the only constant in their world was wind rattling the boards. While other kids learned to ride, Bennett learned to listen. As a boy, he bolted scrap tin blades to a bicycle and let the prairie gusts spin the wheels without touching the pedals. At the local crop duster strip, he watched props warp, vibrate, and twist. Every mechanic cursed bent blades. Bennett noticed something else. Sometimes, by some ugly accident, a damaged tip made a plane glide better. He started writing down those mistakes. When the war came, he enlisted as a prop specialist. In training, he adjusted governors and pitch stops because the wind was fighting wrong. That earned him extra duty and a reputation as a troublemaker. But pilots noticed something the instructors didn't. The quiet kid from Oklahoma could diagnose a vibration by ear and tell, just from the sound of a prop, whether a plane was climbing or dying. Italy gave Bennett his laboratory. Muddy strips, overworked P-47 seconds, and pilots pushed their engines to the edge every single day. He watched wounded jugs limp home on dead engines. Sometimes, when a blade tip had been clipped or a pitch linkage jammed at a strange angle, the big fighter glided farther than it had any right to. None of that showed up in the manuals. All of it went into his notebook. Slowly, a dangerous idea took shape. Drag wasn't just a problem, it was unharvested power. If he could shorten and reshape the tips, if he could force the blades to sit at just the right angle when the engine died, the prop wouldn't act like a brake. It would behave almost like a feathered glider prop, slicing instead of stalling. The problem was simple. Somewhere far away at right field, a similar experiment had once gone bad. A runaway prop, a shredded cowling, and a band stamped in red ink. Propeller geometry is not to be altered under any circumstances. That should have been the end of it. Instead, one night after another, crashed short of the runway, Bennett slipped into the hangar with a hacksaw and a flashlight. He chalked the outer inches of each blade, cut them down, filed them smoothly, and nudged the pitch stops past their safe limits. By dawn, the propeller on that battered P-47 looked wrong to every regulation in the book and exactly right to the numbers in his head. The test pilot arrived like a man walking to his own execution. Captain Ray Collier had been handed a mission that made even JUG veterans nervous, a long, lonely recon loop over water and fjord-cut coastline. 6 hours in a fighter built for 2 or 3. His replacement engine wasn't ready, fuel margins were thin, and everyone knew the odds. Then he saw the prop. Shorter blades, subtle taper, pitch stops reset. It didn't look damaged. It looked deliberately different. "You cut the blades," he said flatly. "Yep," Bennett answered, not looking up. Collier reminded him this was court-martial territory. Bennett just nodded toward the sky. "So is sending you that far with a fuel hog. This way, if the engine quits, you glide like a sailplane instead of a brick." In the end, pilots don't survive by worshipping paperwork. They survive by trusting the man who touches their airplane more than they do. Collier strapped in. On takeoff, the JUG left the ground earlier than usual, climbing with a strange eagerness. Hours later, over cold, empty water, he throttled back for a test. The prop didn't thrash and drag. It rolled into a calm, efficient spin. The heavy fighter held speed and sank like a glider. By the 5th hour, Collier's voice over the radio carried a mix of awe and fear. The fuel gauges were falling, but not the way they should. "I think I can stay up here forever," he muttered. He couldn't. But he did stay for 6 hours and change, then brought the JUG home with fuel left that no P-47 manual could explain. If the story had ended with a long recon and a quiet landing, Bennett's prop would have been a neat rumor. The Luftwaffe made sure it became something else. Just before sunset, the sirens wailed. Incoming raiders. Men killed the lights and ran for cover as German bombers came in low, hunting runways and fuel dumps. Collier was halfway to a trench when his commander grabbed him. "Take your plane. She's not fueled for a fight," Collier protested. "She just flew 6 hours on a 4-hour tank." The answer was simple. "Get in." The engine roared, the altered prop dug into the cold evening air, and the JUG surged down the runway. Tracers walked the pavement just behind him as he hauled back on the stick. Then something happened no one expected. The P-47, that big iron anvil of a fighter, went up like it had been kicked by a giant. It climbed almost straight into the attack, holding energy in the turn instead of bleeding it away. A German Ju-88 tried to roll out of his gun sight. The Thunderbolt stayed glued to its tail. A short burst, and the bomber fell away, burning into the sea. The second raider dove for safety, using gravity and speed the way German crews always had against heavy American fighters. This time, Collier stayed with him and ended it just as fast. 2 kills, 1 sortie, a few minutes in the air. When he rolled back in, the squadron didn't cheer. They just stared at the aircraft and at the propeller that had turned a lumbering JUG into something that fought like a different species. The next morning, the staff car arrived. Olive drab, spotless, and very out of place on a muddy fighter strip. 2 officers stepped out with clipboards, faces set in the way bureaucrats get when they've already decided you're guilty. They walked past the pilots, past the ground crew, and straight to Bennett. No small talk, no thanks. Just charges, unauthorized modification, violation of safety regulations, endangering government property. Around them, the mechanics shifted their weight, fists clenched. The pilots stayed quiet, jaws tight. Everyone knew better than to argue with men who lived on forms and signatures. Bennett wiped his hands on a rag and said calmly, "So you've grounded the one man keeping your planes in the sky. Brilliant." They ignored the line, but they couldn't ignore the numbers. 6-hour endurance on a 4-hour mission, a JUG that climbed like a homesick angel, combat footage, engine data, glide profiles that didn't match anything in the manual. They couldn't let him keep doing it. But they couldn't throw it away either. In the end, the verdict was pure military logic. Bennett was removed from active maintenance duty. The P-47 with the shaved blades was pulled into a hangar and effectively classified. His design was confiscated, stamped secret, and shipped away to be studied by people who had never smelled that hangar at 2 a.m. Officially, his propeller design never existed. Unofficially, pieces of his geometry began showing up, quietly, in test reports and sealed envelopes sent to select maintenance chiefs. When the war ended, the men of that squadron scattered back to farms, factories, and main streets. Reunions came years later. The hair turned grey, the bellies got soft, but one story kept coming back over beers and coffee. Not the big, famous missions, not the headlines. The night, a mechanic with a hacksaw and a head full of wind turned a P-47 into something that could glide home on empty tanks and claw its way through a night raid like a machine from 10 years ahead of its time. Roy Bennett went home too. No medals pinned on his chest for blade geometry, no parades for drag coefficients. He took a job in a small garage and tuned cars. Customers just knew their engines ran smoother when he touched them. Every now and then, a former pilot would step into the doorway, catch his eye, and give a small nod. No speeches, just the kind of respect you don't need to explain. Somewhere, under a tarp in a forgotten warehouse, sits a jug with shorter blades and altered pitch stops. The files on it are buried, the reports locked away. But the men who saw it climb, glide, and come home on empty tanks never forgot. The Air Force could say it never happened. The squadron knew better. And it leaves us with a question. How many of the real breakthroughs in that war didn't come from bright offices and neat drafting tables, but from grease-stained hands in a dark hangar, trusting the wind more than the manual?